So we'd mentioned that you had the overview this morning. We talked about some of the more in-depth concepts of RE and Safety 2 in the morning, and we're going to talk about some of the techniques this afternoon. So I'm going to speak about resilience analysis grid, and I said if I'd known Shu Wen was going to be here early enough, I would have asked her to speak about this, because half of this talk is about her work, her and her team's work. So I just want to tell you that I took all the photos in here so that you can know that all these are from Florida. The only photo I didn't take is the manatee, because I am not good, well, I'm not good at photography, but I can't do underwater photography, so there you go. So, you know, we heard this morning about the resilience potentials, right? And those really form the basis of the resilience analysis grid. So this, hopefully everybody remembers: anticipation, monitoring, responding, and learning. So what the resilience analysis grid is actually an open-ended structured questionnaire. It's organized into 4 sets of questions, so it's a total of 64 questions in the original form. And the idea is that there are certain facets related to each potential, and that these form the basis of the resilience analysis grid. And for those of you who might want to know, this is Boneyard Beach. It's off of Amelia Island, and it has, for whatever reason, not clear why, many, many old trees are laying on it. So the way that these questions are used, and I should say that much of this, in fact all of this work, originated with Eric Hollnagel, and this is from a paper he published in 2015. And so within each potential, there are background questions and foreground questions, and these are very generic. And for example, for these are the background questions for the ability to respond. So they include justification for why this was chosen, or criteria, if you will, or structural aspects of the ability to respond. And it might include things like threshold of responses or verification of responses. Oh, and that's the lighthouse at St. Mark's, if anybody wants to know. And that is thunder, Carl. Okay, just, yeah. So, and the way the original resilience analysis grid was structured was that there were 5 answers. So excellent, satisfactory, acceptable, unacceptable, deficient. And as you might imagine, people would have a tendency to assign a numeric value to this, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But again, this is not a continuous scale, right? This is an ordinal scale. And originally, people had challenges with being able to differentiate between unacceptable and deficient. And this is a sandhill crane. And to make a resilience, to actually perform a resilience analysis grid, or the necessary parts of this are that the people who are involved, who are answering the question, actually need to have some knowledge of the system. So you can't just ask, you know, somebody who is 18 years old and graduated from high school 2 weeks ago and really doesn't know the system. They're not really probably acceptable respondents. And it's important to remember this is not an absolute score. So somebody mentioned, I can't recall who mentioned, this is really much more qualitative. It's not quantitative. It is intended for use in the same system to compare changes over time. And this is the really hard part. Ideally, the same respondents and interviewers should participate over all these time intervals. And there is a need to resist the temptation to add the scores together, to either aggregate them or to average them. Because again, we're talking about ordinal measurements, not absolute and not continuous numbers. So the other piece to remember is that as in its original form, the questions were not weighted. And so, and specifically, what certain potentials, certain facets that might be important in one system may be less important in another system. So that's part of how to think about it. So you can imagine that this is not intuitively easy to do because it is relative, it's qualitative, it's comparative, it is not absolute. And as we were speaking about before, safety 1, we tend to like measurements, we tend to like things we can count, and this is not that. So what does this look like? So this is just a generic example of what a radar graph might look. And we often see the resilience analysis grid in radar graphs. It can also be done as a FRAM, but I'm going to let Axel deal with that because I'm not an expert on FRAM by any stretch of the imagination. So in any case, it's presented as a radar chart, and what you can see is the one to your right is month 4 in a particular system, and the one on your left, other way around. One on your left is month 4, one on your right is month 8. So you can see how the various facets have changed over time. And this is a generic one, not a specific for any particular potential or any particular system. But you can see where things have if you will, improved or become perhaps more capacity, and where there's less capacity than there was originally. The other thing I just want to point out is that I think it was in 2020, Eric published a paper with a couple of other people. It was actually a white paper published for Eurocontrol, and he talked about systemic potential management, which is sort of the newer frame for resilience analysis grid. So it is essentially the evolution of the RAG, but instead of being an RAG, it's an SPM. So we talked about background questions, and then there are foreground questions as well. And foreground questions are really much more about the performance. So this is with respect to the ability to respond, and these are foreground questions. And again, these are generic. They are not meant for a particular system. This is a starting point for developing a RAG for a particular system. And this is the other football. This is American football, and this is actually halftime at an American football game. So again, these are foreground questions from ability to respond, or potential to respond, and potential to monitor. So for example, with some of these, it might be, and this is where the specific system piece becomes important, it becomes important to know how serious is severe enough to respond, like what is the threshold for severity, or as well, how long can a maximal response be sustained? So again, depending on what system it is, the answer may be very different, and the importance of the answer or how it impacts that particular system's ability to perform is going to look very different. So when you begin to develop a RAG for a particular system, the first thing is to take the questions that are the generic questions for all 4 potentials and actually create questions that are more specific to the particular system one is looking at. And so there are some questions that may be very relevant and some questions that may be not relevant at all, and you may decide you're just going to leave those out. And then you may also create sub-questions related, again, to a particular system that are important to that particular system. And again, the questions that are used need to be relevant for that particular microsystem for which you're developing the resilience analysis grid. So this is an ability to respond, and this is, again, radar charts, but you can see the facets are listed. So, for example, the facets include the event list, what events are, or where there are standard responses for that particular system. What is the response capacity? How long can it be sustained? What's the threshold for response? And again, you can see you've got month 4 and month 8, and they look different, and they look different based on the various facets of the ability to respond. So this is where Shuen did, and her team did really incredible work. So there's this resilience analysis grid, and those of us who maybe started in a safety 1 background are somewhat frustrated by sometimes our inability to quantify. And what Shuen and her group did was actually work with Eric around creating I'm going to call it a semi-quantified graph or measurement tool. And so I picked this one because it is an emergency department, and that's where I live clinically. And they looked at creating both ED-specific resilience analysis grid as well as how to then quantified, or at least semi-quantified, and be able to make comparisons over time. So what they did, as we talked about, the questions need to be relevant to the system that we're talking about. So they looked at the content of each question within each facet, within each potential, and they ascribed whether it was important to the ED and whether it was clear or required clarification. And when they worked this all out, and Shuen, if I miss anything or I get it wrong, please correct me. And what they looked at was the original RAG, which is the column to the middle column, if you will, and then what their ED RAG looked like in terms of questions that they specifically created or modified for their emergency department. And so, for example, this is an example of their potential to anticipate the questions they used. And so these were much more specific. They include the same facets, but they were much more specific to their particular microsystem or system. And so they were able to, within one emergency department, look at what would be the RAG, the standard or classic RAG on the right, but now they've got an ED RAG on the left, and this is all with respect to the ability or the capacity for responding. And what they did was actually use the percentage of answers, essentially of positive answers, covered by the graph that they created based on their specific emergency department or their specific system. So they did come up with then a number because they looked at the area covered, or the area that is under, we might say area under the curve, except it's not under a curve, it's sort of encircled or bordered. And then they did that with all the other potentials. So they did it for all 4 potentials, so responding, monitoring, anticipating, learning. And you can see that there's a percentage associated with the area within that border based on what the maximal score would be and what the score they derived. And then with that, they then aggregated that to come up with a score for aggregated resilience, if you will. And that's the part that I'm a little unclear on. So if Shuen will explain that as one of the questions, that would be great. So they were able to derive both a percent or an area under the curve for each potential, as well as an aggregated response. And then they could use this over time to look at, and again, the numbers would not tell the whole story because one would really need to look at the facets within each radar graph. So that's a very lightning introduction to Resilience Analysis Grid. And I think questions now or at the end, Siri, what would you prefer?